You're suffocating, Mom. You're controlling and needy, and Laura and I are done. My son James stood in my living room, his face red with anger, pointing his finger at me like I was some kind of criminal. My 4-year-old granddaughter Danielle hid behind the couch crying, while Laura, my daughter-in-law, stood in my doorway with her arms crossed, nodding like she was watching justice being served. Find some rich man to take care of you, James spat, his voice dripping with disgust. Because we're cutting you off. Completely. Those words echoed in my mind for hours after he stormed out of my house, slamming the door so hard that my old picture frames rattled on the walls. That was 3 days ago, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. Like I was nothing more than a burden he finally found the courage to discard. But what James didn't know was what happened after he left. He didn't know about the phone call I received that same evening. He didn't know about the lawyer who knocked on my door the next morning with papers that would change everything. He had no idea what I'd been doing since he called me suffocating and told me to find someone else to take care of me. You see, James was about to learn that cutting ties with me was the biggest mistake of his life. And if you want to find out how a 68-year-old woman who spent her entire life being taken for granted finally got her revenge, make sure you subscribe, because this story is just getting started. But before we dive into how everything unraveled for James, I need to know, have you ever been called names by someone you sacrificed everything for? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next will shock you. My name is Giota. Let me take you back 35 years, to the day that changed everything. I was 25, working double shifts as a hospital cleaner, scrubbing floors until my knees bled, just to make ends meet. I was exhausted, walking to my beat-up Honda after another 16-hour day, when I stopped at a Detroit gas station to grab a coffee. That's when I saw him. There was this tiny boy, maybe 3 years old, just sitting in a cardboard box next to the dumpster. He wasn't crying or screaming like you expected. He was just sitting there quietly, like he'd already learned that no one was coming to help him. His clothes were dirty, his hair was matted, but those eyes, those big brown eyes, they looked right into my soul. I walked over and found a crumpled note tucked into his little jacket. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Please love him. I can't. That was it. No name, no explanation, nothing else. The gas station attendant told me the boy had been there for hours. His father died in a construction accident 2 weeks earlier, and his teenage mother couldn't cope. She just left him there and disappeared. I was barely making rent on my tiny studio apartment. I had $17 in my checking account and a mountain of bills I couldn't pay. Taking in a child was the last thing I could afford to do. But when I looked at that little boy sitting in that cardboard box, something inside me shifted. Something told me he was meant to be mine. I knelt down and held out my hand, and he took it without hesitation, like he'd been waiting for me his whole life. I took him home that night and never looked back. I named him James after my father, and from that moment on, every decision I made was for him. Raising James meant sacrificing everything I ever wanted, and I mean everything. When James was 4, I received a letter that should have changed my life. I'd been accepted to community college with a full scholarship to study nursing. It was my chance to finally have a real career, to build something for myself. But James needed constant attention and care. He had nightmares from his abandonment, separation anxiety that made him panic whenever I left. So I turned down that scholarship. I threw away my one shot at a real education because my little boy needed me more than I needed my dreams. When James was 6, his teacher told me he needed speech therapy. He was struggling to communicate, falling behind in school. The sessions cost $200 each. I didn't have $200. I didn't even have $20 most weeks. So I did the only thing I could do. I sold my grandmother's engagement ring. It was the only valuable thing I owned, the only connection I had to my family, and I pawned it for $800 to pay for James's therapy sessions. By the time James was 12, he wanted to join the travel baseball team like all his friends. The fees were $3,000, plus equipment, plus travel costs. I worked 16-hour days for 3 months straight, cleaning offices in the morning, stocking shelves at night, and doing laundry for neighbors on weekends. I collapsed from exhaustion twice, once at work and once at home. But I kept going because James deserved to play with his teammates. When James turned 14, I realized our neighborhood was holding him back. The schools weren't good enough, the opportunities weren't there. So I gave up our one-bedroom apartment and moved us into a tiny studio just so James could attend Lincoln High, the best public school in the district. For 8 years, I slept on a pull-out couch in the living room while James had the only real sleeping space. 8 years of waking up with back pain, 8 years of no privacy, 8 years of living like a guest in my own home. I never owned a car newer than 10 years old because every extra dollar went to James's future. I never took a vacation, never went out with friends, never even bought myself a birthday cake. For 22 years, every penny I earned, every sacrifice I made, every dream I gave up, it all went to James. And you know what? I thought I was building something beautiful. I thought I was investing in a son who would love and appreciate me forever. If you're a parent who's ever given up everything for your child, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. When James was 13, something happened that should have changed our lives forever. I met Zayden at the bank where I went every Friday to deposit my meager paychecks. He was the loan officer who helped me when I was behind on rent, and unlike everyone else who looked at me with pity, Zayden looked at me with respect. Zayden was everything I never had. He was kind, stable, financially secure, and he genuinely cared about both James and me. He worked his way up to assistant manager, owned his own house, drove a reliable car, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like someone actually wanted to take care of me instead of the other way around. After 6 months of dating, Zayden proposed. He didn't just want to marry me. He wanted to adopt James officially, give us both his name and his financial stability. He talked about college funds, family vacations, moving us into his 3-bedroom house where James could finally have his own space, and I could stop sleeping on that pull-out couch. For the first time in years, I could picture a real future. James would have a father figure, we'd have financial security, and I could finally breathe. I could maybe even go back to school like I'd always dreamed. Zayden made me feel like I deserved love, like I wasn't just a tired single mother barely keeping her head above water. But James hated the idea. He was jealous, possessive, terrified of sharing me with anyone. He threw tantrums every time Zayden came over, acted out at school, and begged me not to marry him. "You don't need him, Mom," James would cry. "It's just you and me. We don't need anybody else." He made Zayden feel unwelcome, embarrassed him in front of neighbors, and made every family moment a battlefield. I was torn between the love of my life and the child I rescued. But when I looked at James's tear-streaked face, when he wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "Please don't replace me," I made the choice that would haunt me forever. I chose James over love. I broke up with Zayden, the only man who'd ever wanted to take care of us both, because my 13-year-old son couldn't handle sharing me. Zayden begged me to reconsider, promised we could flow, but James had made his position clear. It was him or Zayden. 6 months later, Zayden married Linda, a woman from his church who had no children. They bought a bigger house, took family vacations, and built the life that should have been ours. James never knew that saying no to Zayden meant saying no to the family and financial security we both desperately needed. He never knew that his jealousy cost us everything. All those sacrifices paid off because James became everything I dreamt he could be. He graduated from Northwestern summa cum laude with a perfect GPA, then sailed through law school at the top of his class. When he landed a job at Morrison & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, I cried tears of joy. My little boy, the one I found abandoned in a cardboard box, was now wearing $1,000 suits and working in a skyscraper downtown. That's when he met Laura, and I thought my prayers had been answered. She was a fellow lawyer, brilliant and beautiful, and her father owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Chicago. Laura came from the kind of family that James and I had only dreamed about: country club memberships, vacation homes, connections that opened doors. I thought she was perfect for him. When they got engaged, James asked me to help with the wedding costs. "Mom," he said, "I want this to be perfect. Laura deserves the best." He needed $15,000 for the venue, the flowers, the photographer. Everything had to be top tier because Laura's family expected nothing less. I didn't just pay that $15,000. I cashed out my entire retirement fund. Money I'd been saving for 30 years, dollar by dollar, dreaming of maybe having some security in my old age. 30 years of putting away $20 or $50 whenever I could, and I gave it all to James for one perfect day. I told myself it was worth it to see him happy. When they decided to buy their Lincoln Park condo, a beautiful place overlooking the lake that cost more than I earned in my entire life, James came to me again. "Mom, we're just short on the down payment. Can you help us out?" I gave them my life insurance policy as collateral, the only safety net I had, the only thing that would have taken care of me if something happened. I signed it over to help them get their dream home. And when Danielle was born 3 years ago, I was the proudest grandmother alive. This beautiful little girl with James's brown eyes and Laura's smile, and I thought, finally, we're a real family. Finally, all those sacrifices meant something. James had everything: the career, the wife, the house, the baby. Everything I'd worked my whole life to give him. I thought I built something unbreakable. I thought love and sacrifice had created a bond that nothing could destroy. I was so wrong. But somewhere along the way, I became the problem. It started with little comments that cut deeper than Laura probably realized. We'd be at family gatherings, and I'd mention picking up extra cleaning shifts to help with something, and Laura would physically cringe. Her face would tighten with embarrassment, and she'd quickly change the subject. When her country club friends were around, I learned to stay quiet about my work because Laura would shoot me warning looks across the room. Then came their first wedding anniversary party. I waited for weeks for my invitation, excited to celebrate their milestone, but it never came. When I asked James about it, he said, "Oh, Mom, it's just intimate family only. You understand." I understood, until I saw Laura's Facebook photos the next day. Her parents, her siblings, her aunts and uncles, her college roommates, everyone was there. Everyone except me. Apparently, intimate family didn't include the woman who cashed out her retirement fund to pay for their perfect wedding. When I offered to babysit Danielle so they could have date nights, Laura politely declined. "We prefer professional childcare services," she explained. "They're trained and certified." The woman who raised James from age 3, who sacrificed marriage and security to keep him safe, apparently wasn't qualified to watch their daughter for a few hours. The final blow came at Danielle's 4th birthday party last month. I spent days making her favorite chocolate chip cookies from scratch, the same recipe I used for James when he was little. I wrapped them in a beautiful box with a bow, so proud to contribute something homemade with love. Laura took one look at the box and had a fake smile. "Oh, Giada, these look lovely, but we're trying to keep everything allergen-free certified today." She walked straight to the kitchen and threw my cookies in the garbage while I watched. $40 worth of ingredients and hours of work, tossed away like they were contaminated. I stood there watching other grandmothers hug their grandchildren, watching Laura's mother help Danielle open presents, and I realized I'd become an embarrassment, the burden, the reminder of a life they wanted to forget. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family, make sure you subscribe, because what happened next will leave you stunned. But tell me honestly, have you ever been made to feel ashamed of where you came from by people you sacrificed everything for? Because the way they treated me after everything I'd given them was about to push me over the edge. Last week, I finally reached my breaking point. I hadn't seen Danielle in 3 weeks, and when I called to ask about visiting, Laura made excuse after excuse. So I drove over to their house and knocked on the door. "James," I said when he answered, "I just want to understand why I can't see Danielle anymore. What did I do wrong?" That's when he exploded. "What did you do wrong?" he screamed, his face turning red with rage. "Mom, you're suffocating, you're controlling and needy, and Laura and I are done with it." I could hear little Danielle crying from behind the couch where she was hiding, terrified by her father's outburst. My heart broke seeing my granddaughter scared, but James kept going. You show up unannounced, you guilt trip us about family time, you act like we owe you something just because you raised me," he yelled, pointing his finger at me like I was some kind of criminal. "We have boundaries, and you can't respect them." Laura stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, nodding along like she was watching justice being served. She didn't say a word to defend me or calm James down. She just stood there, satisfied that someone was finally putting me in my place. "You're too needy," James continued, his voice getting louder. "We're cutting ties with you. Completely. We can't handle your drama anymore." Then came the final blow. The words that shattered whatever was left of my heart. "Find some rich man to take care of you, because we can't anymore." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same boy who had thrown tantrums and begged me not to marry Zayden, who had cried that he didn't want to share me with anyone, was now telling me to find someone else to take care of me. The child I'd chosen over love and financial security was now demanding I become someone else's problem. I stood there in shock as James stormed out of the room. Laura finally spoke up, but only to say, "I think it's best if you leave now, Giada." I drove home in silence, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The next day, James sent me a text. "We're cutting ties. Don't contact us again. This is final." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I typed back one word. Understood. What James didn't know was that I meant it. I understood more than he could possibly imagine. Here's what James didn't know. 2 days after his text, while I was still processing the words, "We're cutting ties," there was a knock on my door. A man in an expensive suit stood on my porch holding a briefcase. "Are you Giada Collins?" he asked. When I nodded, he said, "My name is Robert Martinez. I'm an estate attorney from Los Angeles, and I need to speak with you about your great-uncle Theodore." I was confused. "I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone named Theodore." That's when he explained something that changed everything. Theodore Collins was my grandmother's brother who had moved to California in the 1960s. I'd never heard his name because my family lost touch with him decades before I was born. Theodore had never married, never had children, and had spent the last 10 years of his life searching for any remaining family members. When he found my name in old family records, he didn't just reach out. Instead, he'd been quietly watching my life from afar. He hired private investigators to learn about me, to see what kind of person I was. He knew about my struggles as a single mother. He knew about the sacrifices I made for James. He knew about the cleaning jobs, the sleepless nights, the way I'd given up everything for a child who wasn't even biologically mine. Theodore was impressed by my character. In all his research, he found that I'd never asked for handouts, never complained publicly, never abandoned my responsibilities. He saw a woman who worked 3 jobs to put her son through college, who chose love over personal comfort again and again. Robert Martinez opened his briefcase and handed me documents that made my head spin. Theodore had made a fortune in California real estate development. When he died 6 months ago, he left everything to me, his only living relative. $12 million from property sales and investments, plus a beautiful estate in Malibu with ocean views that I didn't even know existed. The same day, James called me suffocating and told me to find some rich man to take care of me. I had become one of the wealthiest women in America. The universe has a sense of humor, doesn't it? If you want to see how this story ends, and what James's reaction was when he found out, smash that subscribe button, because the next part will blow your mind. After that inheritance, I knew exactly what to do with the money. I didn't buy designer clothes or a fancy car, or take expensive vacations. Instead, I founded the Giada Collins Foundation for Single Mothers. I wanted to provide everything I never had: housing assistance for mothers who couldn't afford rent, childcare services so they could work without worrying, and education funds so their children could go to college without their mothers emptying retirement accounts. I remembered what it felt like to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, to work 3 jobs and still fall behind, to sacrifice my own future for my child's dreams. Within 3 months, I opened our first transitional housing facility, a beautiful complex with 12 apartments where single mothers could live affordably while getting back on their feet. I hired social workers, childcare specialists, and tutors. I created the support system I desperately needed 35 years ago when I was struggling to raise James alone. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly I was everywhere. Former hospital worker becomes major philanthropist. The headlines read, "There I was on Channel 7, cutting the ribbon on our housing facility, wearing a dress that cost more than I used to make in a month." The reporter called me an inspiration and proof that good hearts are rewarded. During the interview, they asked me about my motivation. I looked directly into the camera and said, "Every single mother deserves support, not judgment. They deserve a community that lifts them up, not one that makes them feel ashamed for struggling." I was thinking about myself 35 years ago, but I was also thinking about every woman who'd ever been told she wasn't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough of help. The story went viral locally. Suddenly, everyone in Chicago knew about Giada Collins and her foundation. Donations poured in from other families who wanted to help. Corporate sponsors reached out. Politicians called wanting to meet with me. I'd gone from being an embarrassment to being celebrated as a community hero. And James had no idea any of this was happening. That's when James saw it. I was at home, reviewing applications for our next housing facility, when I imagined the chaos that must have been happening at James and Laura's house. Laura's mother had called in a complete panic. "Laura, honey, is that your mother-in-law on television? The one donating millions of dollars to charity?" I could picture James rushing to the TV, probably thinking his mother-in-law was confused. But there I was on Channel 7's Evening News, wearing an elegant navy dress, standing next to the mayor as we announced a $5 million expansion of the foundation. James probably grabbed his laptop next, frantically typing my name into Google. Article after article would have popped up. Local philanthropist donates $2 million to education fund. Giada Collins opens second housing facility for single mothers. From struggle to success, how one woman is changing lives. There were photos of me at charity galas, shaking hands with senators and celebrities, pictures of me speaking at conferences about poverty and single motherhood. Interviews where I talked about my own journey from struggle to success, though I was careful never to mention James or his ingratitude. The same woman he called suffocating just 3 days earlier was being celebrated as a community hero. The mother he'd told to find a rich man had become a rich woman. The embarrassment he'd tried to hide from his country club friends was now more successful and respected than he could ever dream of being. I could only imagine James staring at his computer screen, reading headline after headline, seeing photo after photo of his needy mother living a life of purpose and abundance that he knew nothing about. That's when his phone started dialing my number. Over and over and over. But I didn't answer. Not the first call, not the 10th, not the 50th. I watched my phone buzz on the kitchen counter while I sipped tea from a china cup that cost more than James made in a week. Each missed call was sweeter than the last. When I finally answered his call on attempt number 102, James was sobbing like a broken child. "Mom, I saw the news. I saw everything. I made a terrible, terrible mistake. Please, we need to talk. Family is everything. Family means everything to me." I let him cry for a moment before I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, nothing like the desperate woman he'd screamed at just days before. "James," I said quietly, "you told me we were cutting ties." I replied, "Understood," because I meant it. I understood exactly what you were saying. "But Mom, I was angry. I was stressed about work, and Laura was upset, and you threw me away," I interrupted. "The moment I stopped being useful to you, the moment Laura decided I was an embarrassment, you discarded me like garbage. For 43 years, I put you first. I gave up love, education, security, dreams, everything for you. And when you got everything you wanted, when you had your perfect life, you decided I was suffocating." James tried to speak, but I wasn't finished. "Here's what you still don't understand, James. This isn't about the money. This isn't about the foundation, or the news coverage, or any of it. This is about being told by my own son that I needed to find someone else to take care of me after I spent my entire life taking care of him." I paused, letting that sink in. "I've rewritten my will. Every penny of that $12 million goes to the foundation and to single mothers who understand the value of sacrifice, You wanted to cut ties, so I'm respecting your boundary. You taught me that love isn't enough when someone decides you're disposable. James was sobbing harder now, begging me to reconsider, promising he'd changed, saying Laura was sorry too. But I'd heard enough broken promises from people who only valued me when they needed something. You wanted independence from your suffocating mother, I said before hanging up. Congratulations, son. You got it. My name is Giada Collins. I spent 43 years being taken for granted, and I'm finally living for myself. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most teach us the most valuable lesson of all, that we're worth more than we ever believed. If this story taught you something about knowing your worth, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell because there are more stories like this coming.